7 miles of open water between you and the bottom. Stack 24 Empire State Buildings on top of each other, drop them in, and the tip still sits underwater. The Tonga Trench is the second deepest place on Earth, and it sits above the fastest moving tectonic plate on the planet. It has produced the most powerful volcanic eruption ever recorded by modern instruments, earthquakes 600 miles underground, and creatures that should be scientifically impossible. We are going to the sharks that attack cameras, the squid with 26-foot arms, and the microbes that survive pressure that would shatter steel. If you enjoy this journey, drop a like and subscribe. Let's go. Picture the tallest building you have ever seen. Now picture the Empire State Building, 102 floors, over 1,400 feet from the street to the tip of its antenna. Now stack 24 of them on top of each other. That tower would rise almost 7 miles into the sky, taller than any cloud, taller than most commercial flights. Drop that entire structure into the Tonga Trench and every floor, every window, every rooftop antenna disappears under the surface. The tip of the final building would still sit nearly 800 feet underwater. That is how deep the Tonga Trench goes. Its deepest point is called the Horizon Deep. It sits in the southwestern Pacific Ocean, northeast of New Zealand, east of the island chain of Tonga. The depth there measures around 35,000 feet. To put that in terms you can actually feel, that is roughly the same altitude at which passenger jets cruise across the country. When you fly from New York to Los Angeles and look out the window at the ground 7 miles below, you're looking at the same distance that separates the ocean surface from the bottom of this trench. The trench runs about 850 miles from north to south. That is roughly the same distance as driving from Miami to New York. The width averages around 50 miles, which is about the distance from downtown Los Angeles to the Santa Monica beach. Along its floor, the walls close in to a steep V-shape, narrow and dark, with cliffs dropping sharper than anything on dry land. The Tonga Trench is the second deepest place on Earth. The only thing deeper is the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, located far away in the northern Pacific. But that small difference in depth hides something remarkable. In almost every other way, speed, violence, geological force, the Tonga Trench wins. The Mariana sits quiet by comparison, and that is the part most people never hear about. Scientists who spend their careers in deep ocean research describe a feeling that hits every time they look at the data from this place. A low, steady unease. The trench behaves in ways that push against what the textbooks say is possible. The creatures down there should not exist under those conditions. The geological forces creating it are faster and more extreme than almost anywhere else on the planet. And the trench is still largely unexplored. As of the most ambitious expedition ever attempted there, completed in late 2024, huge sections of the seafloor remain unmapped and unstudied. The average depth across the entire trench is around 20,000 feet. That means even the shallow parts are 4 miles underwater. The section called the Horizon Deep drops another 1.5 miles past that average, plunging into territory where the weight of the ocean above would crush an unprotected human body in a fraction of a second. At this depth, light from the surface cannot reach. The temperature hovers near freezing. Sound moves differently than it does in shallower water. Pressure builds to levels that require specially engineered submarines, because the force down there does not bend metal, it collapses it. Most humans will never see this place. Only one person in history has ever piloted a crewed vehicle to the very bottom of the Horizon Deep, and what he found when he got there raised more questions than it answered. But before we get to the bottom, we need to understand how scientists even found this trench in the first place. Because the story of its discovery is far stranger than most people expect. In December of 1952, a research ship called the Horizon was crossing the South Pacific on a routine science expedition. The crew was doing what ocean scientists did back then, dropping weighted lines into the water and measuring how long it took for them to hit the bottom. It was slow, tedious work. Most readings came back with numbers they expected. Then one reading came back completely wrong. The number was so large that the crew ran the measurement again. Same result. They ran it a third time. The line kept going, and going. When it finally hit bottom and came back up, the measurement showed a depth that no one had recorded in the entire southern hemisphere. The research team named the spot after their own ship, the Horizon Deep. The world mostly did not notice. This was 1952. There were no deep-sea cameras, no robotic submersibles, no live satellite feeds. The crew wrote down their numbers, published a paper, and the discovery sat quietly in scientific journals for decades. Every few years, another expedition would pass over and confirm the reading, but actually getting down there to look around was a completely different problem. Lowering any kind of camera or instrument to 35,000 feet requires equipment that does not simply break, it gets destroyed. Standard steel cables are too heavy for their own weight at those lengths. Glass bottles collapse under pressure before they reach the bottom. Metal housings crack. Electronics flood. Getting instruments down and back up in one piece took decades of engineering progress to solve. Scientists began developing a different approach. Instead of lowering equipment on a wire, they built autonomous landers, devices that sink themselves to the bottom, sit there for hours collecting data and footage, then drop a ballast weight and float back up on their own. No cable required, just physics and patience. Even then, the landers did not always come back. Equipment sent to the Horizon Deep on one expedition never resurfaced. Scientists believe it collapsed under the pressure on its final deployment, lost forever on the seafloor along with whatever footage it had captured in those final hours. The loss was, according to one team member, a real blow, because that last deployment would have been the deepest and most valuable of the entire mission. The ocean does not give up its data easily. The Tonga Trench sat largely unexplored for most of the 20th century, known to exist but too deep and too remote and too destructive to study properly. The few expeditions that reached it came back with fragments. A handful of organisms, some water samples, a few sonar maps. Each fragment raised new questions. Each answer opened another set of unknowns. And lurking beneath all of those questions was a geological fact that nobody had fully reckoned with. The reason this trench exists at all is the same reason it terrifies scientists the most. The deeper problem was one of distance. The Tonga Trench sits in one of the most remote stretches of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from any major research port. Getting a ship out there takes weeks. Keeping it on station in deep Pacific swells, while delicate equipment is deployed and retrieved, takes enormous seamanship and budget. Early expeditions had to make impossible trade-offs between scientific ambition and the limits of what their ships, their cables, and their instruments could actually handle at those depths. Something enormous is moving underneath it, and it is moving faster than anything else on the surface of this planet. The ground beneath your feet is not still. Every continent, every ocean floor, every mountain range sits on a massive slab of rock called a tectonic plate. These slabs float on the hot, slow-moving rock of the mantle below. They drift, they collide, they grind past each other, and they have been doing this for billions of years. Most of the time, the movement is so slow you would never notice it. The North American plate moves about an inch a year. That is roughly as fast as your fingernails grow. Over a human lifetime, it shifts about as far as the length of a car. Nothing dramatic at the human scale. The Tonga Trench sits at a very different kind of plate boundary. Here, the Pacific Plate is slamming westward into the Indo-Australian Plate at a speed of around 9 inches per year. That may still sound slow, but in geological terms it is extraordinary. It is more than double the speed of the plates at the Mariana Trench. It is 6 times faster than the San Andreas Fault in California, the fault that produced the famous San Francisco earthquake. Scientists with GPS instruments planted along the Tonga Zone have measured this speed directly over years of observation, and the data keeps confirming the same result. This is the fastest plate convergence rate measured anywhere on Earth. What happens when one plate runs into another at that speed? The heavier plate dives. The Pacific Plate, old and dense, plunges downward beneath the lighter Indo-Australian Plate. This dive is called subduction, and the angle combined with the sheer speed of the movement carves a deep groove into the seafloor. That groove is the Tonga Trench. Every year, 9 inches of Pacific seafloor disappears into the earth along this line. That is old ocean crust, rock that formed at a spreading centre millions of years ago, travelled slowly across the Pacific, and now gets pulled down into the hot mantle where it slowly melts. The trench is, in a sense, a recycling machine for the ocean floor. Ancient rock vanishing back into the planet that made it. But recycling at this speed comes with consequences. The friction between the two plates generates earthquakes. The heat from the descending plate melts rock, which rises to form volcanoes directly above the subduction zone. and the speed of the whole process means those earthquakes and volcanoes are more frequent and more violent here than at almost any other place on Earth. Scientists estimate the Pacific Plate at this location has been diving for millions of years. As it descends, it drags with it whatever sits on top: sediment, organic material, fragments of ocean crust. All of it gets pulled down toward the mantle, and as it goes deeper, the pressure and the temperature do strange things to that material. At depths of more than 400 miles underground, earthquakes happen that should not be physically possible. The rock at that depth should be too hot and too soft to snap. But in the Tonga subduction zone, something holds the slab together long enough to produce massive quakes hundreds of miles underground. We will get to those earthquakes later. First, the consequences of that plate speed hit the surface in a way that no other geological event on Earth can match. Imagine someone places a fingertip on the back of your hand and pushes, gently, about 1 pound of force. You barely feel it. Now imagine that same force compressed into a space the size of a pinhead. That single point would punch straight through your skin. Pressure at the horizon. Deep does not work exactly like that, but the comparison captures the key idea. It is about force per square inch. At the bottom of the Tonga Trench, every single square inch of any surface carries around 16,000 pounds of pressure. That is roughly the weight of 4 mid-size cars, balanced on a space the size of a postage stamp. For context, the pressure at the ocean surface is about 14.5 pounds per square inch. Just the weight of the atmosphere above you. Every 30 feet of depth adds another 14.5 pounds. Go down 30 feet while swimming and you feel it in your ears. By the time you reach the bottom of the horizon deep, the pressure has multiplied over 1,000 times. Standard steel equipment does not survive this. Empty glass bottles sent to the bottom of the Tonga Trench on science expeditions have come back as solid glass pucks. The internal airspace crushed completely flat. The original bottle shape still visible but compressed to the size of a jar lid. On one expedition, a camera with attached collection bottles was deployed 4 separate times. The first 3 trips ended successfully. The 4th time, the equipment never resurfaced. Scientists believe the bottles exceeded their pressure limit and collapsed, taking everything with them. Styrofoam cups attached to research equipment come back the size of thimbles. The air bubbles inside the foam get squeezed out entirely, and what remains is a dense, shrunken replica, perfectly shaped but compressed to a fraction of its original size. Human lungs would compress to roughly the size of a fist before a diver reached even a fraction of that depth, which is why the only way anyone has ever reached the horizon deep is inside a vessel engineered specifically to resist extreme pressure. Those vessels have walls several inches thick, built from titanium alloys machined to tolerances tighter than the width of a human hair. The cold adds another layer of difficulty. At the bottom of the Tonga Trench, the water temperature hovers around 34 degrees Fahrenheit, barely above freezing. Any biological process, any chemical reaction, any movement of any creature down there happens in permanent darkness, permanent near-freezing cold, at pressures that collapse the cameras scientists send to study them. And yet life exists at the bottom. Dense, thriving, active life. Creatures that have figured out how to keep their cells functioning under those 16,000 pounds per square inch. Scientists who first pulled up animals from these depths expected maybe a few simple organisms. What they found completely changed what anyone thought was biologically possible. Scientists who study deep-sea pressure use a simple demonstration to explain what happens to ordinary objects at these depths. A sealed plastic water bottle, the kind from a gas station, dropped over the side of a research vessel above the Tonga Trench crumples inward within the first few thousand feet. By 10,000 feet it is crushed to a dense brick. At the bottom, it would be unrecognizable as an object that ever held liquid. The air inside it, which filled the full bottle at the surface, has been compressed into a volume smaller than a fingertip. But before the creatures, one human being decided he needed to go down there himself and see it in person. On June 10th, 2019, a retired American naval officer named Victor Vescovo climbed into a submarine barely larger than a walk-in closet and began descending toward the bottom of the horizon deep. He was attempting something that had never been done. No human being had ever reached the deepest point in the southern hemisphere in a crewed vehicle. The dive would take him around 4 hours to reach the bottom, moving through total darkness, in water just above freezing, with the pressure outside climbing by roughly 14 pounds per square inch with every 30 feet he descended. The submarine was called the DSV limiting factor. Its hull was made of titanium, more than 3.5 inches thick. The viewport, a single porthole-sized window through which Vescovo could see the outside, was made of transparent acrylic machined to handle the full force of the Tonga Trench's pressure. The entire crew compartment was a sphere about 4.5 feet wide. He sat folded inside it alone. Outside, for the first 2 hours, there was essentially nothing to see. Particles of organic debris drifted past in the beam of the exterior lights, what ocean scientists call marine snow, but no large creatures, no visible features, just the slow dimming of the water from dark blue to absolute black. Then the bottom came into view. Vescovo later described a flat, pale, sandy landscape stretching in every direction. The seafloor at Horizon Deep is not dramatic the way you might picture. There are no towering rock formations, no glowing hydrothermal vents. It looks almost calm, eerie in its stillness. But what Vescovo found sitting on that calm, flat floor sent a quiet shock through the scientists waiting on the surface ship. He found plastic. A small piece of human-made debris was visible on the seafloor at the deepest point in the southern hemisphere, 7 miles below the surface of the ocean. Vescovo photographed it. When the images came back up with the submarine, researchers went very quiet. The Tonga Trench had been considered one of the few major deep-sea environments still free of human contamination. That assumption was now in serious doubt. The dive on the bottom lasted several hours. Vescovo examined the seafloor, collected sensor data, and then released the ballast weights. The submarine began its 4-hour rise back to the surface. It emerged into bright Pacific daylight, completing the first crewed visit to the bottom of the Horizon Deep in history. The expedition had planned a second dive to the same location the following day. An electrical fault discovered during the post-dive inspection made it impossible. Repairs would take 48 hours, and the ship's schedule had to hold. The second dive was cancelled. The bottom has not been visited by a human being since. What Vescovo found down there, the plastic, the pale sediment, the eerie silence, raised questions that scientists have been working through ever since. But the real violence connected to the Tonga Trench does not happen at the bottom. The dive planning itself took years. Engineers tested the titanium hull at simulated pressures before any human entered. Every seal and electrical penetration was scrutinized, because at those pressures, a single weak point lets in a jet of water moving faster than a rifle bullet. It happens above the water, far above it. On January 15, 2022, at around 5 in the morning local time, an underwater volcano sitting directly above the Tonga subduction zone tore itself apart. The volcano had been building pressure for weeks. Satellite images showed it sending up steam and ash clouds since late December. Scientists tracked the activity but had seen this pattern from this volcano before. It had erupted in smaller bursts in 2009, 2014, and 2015. Each time it settled back down. Most researchers expected the same pattern. What happened instead became the most powerful volcanic eruption directly observed by modern instruments in all of recorded human history. The explosion released energy comparable to hundreds of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. It sent a column of ash, steam, and volcanic gases more than 36 miles straight up into the sky, punching through the stratosphere into a layer of the atmosphere that volcanic eruptions almost never reach. Scientists measuring the plume had to check their instruments multiple times because the altitude numbers seemed impossible. More water vapor was injected into the stratosphere by this single eruption than by any volcanic event ever directly measured. Around 150 million tons of water entered the upper atmosphere in a matter of hours. Researchers studying the long-term atmospheric data estimate this injection may affect global climate patterns for years, possibly warming the lower atmosphere slightly as that water eventually disperses. The pressure wave from the explosion travelled outward at around 700 miles per hour, roughly the speed of sound. It circled the Earth completely, then it circled again. Sensitive pressure sensors in Alaska, in Europe, in Japan, and in Antarctica all recorded it passing. Some stations picked up the wave on its fourth pass around the planet. Every weather monitoring station on Earth registered something moving through on that day. a ripple of compressed air connecting every country on the globe to a single explosion in the South Pacific. The explosion generated tsunamis that struck Tonga within minutes, inundating low-lying coastal areas with waves 4 to 5 feet tall. The waves then crossed the Pacific. They hit Japan. They reached the coast of Chile and Peru, where an unexpected surge overtopped harbour walls and caused an oil tanker to leak into the sea. Unusual wave action was recorded along the California coast hours later. All of this came from a single volcano that sits at the edge of the Tonga Trench, built by the exact same geological forces driving the plate subduction below. The eruption destroyed most of the volcanic island that had stood above the surface before the event. Satellite images taken days afterward showed a ring of ash and debris where the island had been, surrounded by discoloured water stretching for miles. The island itself was largely gone, collapsed back into the ocean in one of the most dramatic geological self-destructions ever captured by satellite. Scientists studying the Tonga subduction zone had warned for years that this volcanic arc was dangerously active. Their papers said so. Their conference presentation said so. The 2022 eruption confirmed every worst-case calculation they had written. The scale of water injected into the stratosphere deserves its own moment. 150 million tons of water vapour from a single eruption is a number researchers say has no modern comparison. Water vapour in the stratosphere acts as a greenhouse gas, trapping heat. Scientists have published studies suggesting the injection from this single event may measurably warm the planet's surface for years before it finally dissipates. A volcanic eruption leaving a fingerprint on global temperature records, and the earthquakes this region produces are in a category entirely their own. When a tectonic plate snaps and sends out an earthquake, that snap happens because rock breaks. Rock breaks when it is cold enough to be brittle and under enough stress to exceed its strength. Deep underground, where temperatures soar and enormous pressure turns rock nearly plastic, the theory says rock should flow and bend rather than snap. Below a certain depth, earthquakes should be physically impossible. That depth is generally around 430 miles underground. The Tonga subduction zone produces earthquakes at 700 miles underground. This is a problem for the physics. Scientists call these deep focus earthquakes, and they are rare everywhere on Earth except here. Around 2/3 of all deep focus earthquakes ever recorded globally have originated in or near the Tonga subduction zone. The region holds the highest concentration of extreme depth earthquakes measured anywhere on the planet. The reason comes back to speed. The Pacific Plate dives so fast into the mantle here that it does not have time to heat up the way slower subducting slabs do. It carries cold, brittle rock down with it, maintaining temperatures low enough to allow fractures to occur far deeper than standard models predict. The plate is essentially too fast for the surrounding heat to catch up with it. At those depths, individual earthquakes do not shake the ground above the way shallow quakes do. A magnitude 7 event at 700 miles underground barely rattles coffee cups at the surface. But these deep events matter enormously to geologists because they reveal what is happening to the descending slab, how it bends, how it buckles under its own weight, how it eventually loses its structure and merges with the surrounding mantle. The Tonga zone has also produced dangerous shallow earthquakes far closer to the surface. In September of 2009, an event just off the northern end of the trench generated a tsunami that killed nearly 200 people across Samoa, American Samoa and Tonga. A magnitude 8 event in 2006 struck the shallower section of the fault. The zone has recorded multiple magnitude 7 events within single decades. The region sits firmly inside the Pacific Ring of Fire, the belt of subduction zones circling the Pacific Basin where the majority of the world's seismic energy releases every year. But those shallow events, as destructive as they are, happen at distances and depths that seismologists have models for. The 700-mile deep earthquakes are still not fully explained. Every time researchers think they have identified the mechanism, whether it is mineral phase changes, pockets of fluid, or something in the structure of the descending slab itself, new data from the Tonga zone produces results that complicate the picture further. This is what makes the Tonga subduction zone so scientifically important. It does not just produce bigger versions of what other subduction zones produce, it produces things that other subduction zones do not produce at all. The consequences of frequent deep earthquakes extend far beyond the seismology itself. Each time the descending slab fractures at depth, it changes the stress state of the surrounding rock. Scientists have documented slow deformation events, gradual aseismic slipping, occurring in the intervals between the larger recorded earthquakes at the Tonga zone. These slow events happen silently, without causing the shaking that seismometers detect as earthquakes, yet they move rock and transfer stress in ways that matter for understanding when and where the next large, shallow event might occur. And what it did to the atmosphere in 2022 was something no one on Earth had ever witnessed before. The 2022 eruption did something that scientists had only read about in history books. When Krakatoa erupted in 1883, it sent a pressure wave around the world multiple times. Instruments of that era could barely detect it. Scientists reconstructed what happened through historical barometer records and calculated the wave's path after the fact. Then, for over a century, no eruption came anywhere close to doing the same thing again. Until January 15, 2022. The Tonga eruption sent a wave of compressed air racing outward from the explosion site in every direction simultaneously. This kind of wave, called a Lamb wave, moves at the speed of sound, around 750 miles per hour, and it travels invisibly through the lower atmosphere. It is not a sound anyone standing outside could hear. It is a ripple in air pressure, an invisible ring of compressed and rarefied air expanding around the planet like a slow-motion sonic boom. Weather stations, pressure sensors, and scientific monitoring equipment detected it passing first in New Zealand, then Australia, then moving west across Asia, through Europe, across the Atlantic, over North America, and back into the Pacific. The wave circled the entire Earth. Then it bounced back, passed through the eruption site again, and continued circling. Sensors picked it up, passing their location 4 or 5 times over the following days, each pass slightly weaker than the last as the energy spread and dissipated. The pressure change itself was small enough that nobody standing outside would feel it on their skin. But for instruments tracking global atmospheric pressure, the signal was unmistakable on every continent simultaneously, a signature connecting every monitoring station on Earth to a single explosion in the South Pacific at a specific moment in time. Scientists also detected something else from the eruption. It generated infrasound, sound waves at frequencies too low for human hearing, that travelled through the ground itself. Seismic stations thousands of miles away recorded signals that initially resembled small earthquakes. When researchers cross-referenced the timing and the apparent origin point, every signal traced back to the same event, the same explosion, the same location above the Tonga Trench. The eruption also punched a disturbance into the ionosphere, the electrically charged layer of the upper atmosphere around 50 to 600 miles above the surface. Sensors tracking ionospheric conditions recorded a disruption rippling outward from the eruption site, propagating through the charged layer above the planet. This kind of ionospheric disturbance from a volcanic event is documented only during the most extreme geophysical events ever recorded in the modern era. All of this came from a single geological boundary, a single collision zone between 2 plates. The consequences were measurable on every continent, at every altitude, in every layer of the atmosphere. The coordination of global instruments that captured the 2022 shockwave tells its own story about modern Earth science. Sensors in Greenland and sensors in New Zealand, separated by nearly 10,000 miles, recorded the same wave passing within the expected time interval, allowing scientists to calculate the wave's speed and confirm its global propagation in real time, rather than reconstructing it from historical records afterward. The event became one of the best documented examples of global atmospheric wave propagation ever recorded, studied by atmospheric scientists who had never expected to have such clean, complete data from a single natural event. But the surface events, eruptions, tsunamis, shockwaves, are only half the story. 7 miles below where all of this happened, a completely different world was carrying on in the dark, totally unchanged. Before scientists could study the biology of the Tonga Trench, they had to see it. Really see it, not just drop a line and measure the depth, but map the actual shape of the floor, the walls, the ridges, the fault scarps, and the canyon systems running down the slope into the deep. That mapping took decades of intermittent effort. The Tonga Trench has a steep V-shaped cross-section. The outer wall, the side where the Pacific Plate bends downward as it begins its descent, slopes at around 3 to 5 degrees. That sounds gentle until you picture the scale. 3 to 5 degrees across a slope dropping nearly 7 miles produces a wall so vast it dwarfs any canyon on land. The inner wall on the opposite side is steeper, sometimes exceeding 10 degrees, and it is broken up by faults, cliffs, and ledges carved by the ongoing geological deformation of the overriding plate. Running down those inner walls are submarine canyons. These are massive channels carved by sediment moving down the slope, sand, clay, and organic debris sliding off the platform above and funneling toward the trench floor below. Some of these canyons rival significant river valleys on land in scale. They carry material that eventually settles at the bottom, building up the sediment layers that scientists core through to study the history of what has been falling into the trench over millions of years. The trench floor itself is narrow. In the deepest sections, the V-shape narrows to less than 6 miles across. The floor is textured. Small ridges, fault features, and the accumulated debris of geological time, rather than the perfectly flat muddy plain that people sometimes picture when imagining the deep sea floor. In 2024, a research team spent 3 months systematically mapping the Tonga Trench with modern multi-beam sonar. Their ship traced back and forth across more than 64,000 square miles of seafloor, building the most detailed picture of this entire system ever produced. The maps revealed previously unseen features, small basins within the main trench axis, sections of wall that had collapsed and slid downslope in ancient submarine landslides, and geological patterns in the seafloor rock that raised new questions about how subduction shapes the crust over time. The mapping data was donated immediately to the Global Initiative, working to chart the entire ocean floor by 2030. As of now, less than a quarter of the ocean bottom has been mapped to the resolution that scientists have for most land surfaces on Earth. The Tonga Trench, despite being one of the most geologically important and biologically active places on Earth, had vast sections that were essentially unknown before 2024. Scientists could tell the depth, but not the shape. They could measure the biology at specific sample points, but not understand the landscape those organisms lived in. The canyon systems running down the inner wall of the Tonga Trench are not static. They are active transport pathways. When an earthquake shakes the trench, it can trigger sediment flows, fast-moving avalanches of mud and organic material that surge down these channels and deposit suddenly on the trench floor. Scientists studying seafloor cores from deep trenches worldwide have found distinct layers in the sediment, thin bands of material that arrived all at once rather than settling slowly. Each band marks a past event, a shaking that sent material cascading down from above. The trench floor is a geological archive of every earthquake significant enough to disturb the slope above it. What the new maps revealed was a landscape stranger and more complex than the data had suggested, and what lives inside that landscape defies almost everything intuition would predict. Scientists divide the ocean into zones based on depth, the way you might divide a building into floors. The sunlit surface zone, the twilight zone below it where light fades, the midnight zone below that, in total darkness but still part of the open ocean. Each zone has its own pressure range, temperature range, and community of organisms adapted to live there. Below 6 miles, the ocean enters a zone that barely exists in popular culture. Scientists call it the Hadal Zone. It takes its name from Hades, the ancient Greek underworld. The name was chosen deliberately. The Hadal Zone covers all ocean depths below around 20,000 feet. It exists almost entirely inside ocean trenches. The open seafloor of the deep ocean, the abyssal plain, does not reach Hadal depths. Only in trenches, where the descending tectonic plate carves a groove far below the surrounding seafloor, does the Hadal Zone exist at all. In total, all the Hadal zones on Earth together cover less than 1% of the ocean floor. They are isolated pockets, cut off from each other and from everything above by miles of cold water. In the Hadal Zone, the rules governing almost every other ocean environment stop applying. Photosynthesis is completely impossible. No sunlight reaches this depth. Temperature stays near freezing permanently, year after year, with no seasonal variation. Pressure climbs high enough to collapse most biological structures. Food from the surface takes months to drift down in tiny particles. The nutrients sustaining most ocean ecosystems trickle in as fragments, not flows. And yet the Hadal Zone is alive, consistently, actively alive. Scientists studying Hadal trenches worldwide have found the same pattern repeating across multiple locations. The deeper you go inside a trench, the fewer species you find, but the more individuals of those surviving species you encounter. At the very bottom of the horizon deep, fewer types of organisms live there than at slightly shallower depths on the trench wall. But the organisms that do survive at maximum depth exist in remarkable numbers. Roundworm populations at the bottom were measured at 6 times the density of those found partway up the same trench at a shallower site. More individuals at the deepest point, greater population density where the conditions are most extreme. Scientists have competing explanations for this, involving the funnel shape of the trench concentrating food, competitive pressure being lower at depth, and other factors. No definitive answer exists yet. The isolation of different Hadal zones from each other is also scientifically fascinating. The Tonga Trench is not connected to the Mariana Trench or any other deep trench by a continuous Hadal corridor. They are separated by thousands of miles of abyssal plain, at depths too shallow for Hadal species to cross. This means the amphipod communities, the worm communities, and the microbial communities of each trench have been evolving in isolation for millions of years, developing genetic differences that reflect their separation. Studying those differences tells scientists how fast evolution moves in extreme environments, and what features of Hadal life are universal, versus what emerged independently in each isolated pocket of deep ocean. The Hadal zone is fed almost entirely by a process that begins 7 miles above it, on the lit surface of the ocean where everything grows. Everything in the sunlit ocean eventually dies. Phytoplankton, microscopic plant-like organisms that form the base of almost every ocean food chain and live for days or weeks, then die. Zooplankton eat them, grow, then die too. Fish eat the zooplankton, live longer, and eventually die as well. Whales, sharks, sea turtles, all of them run out of time, and when they die, their bodies sink. On the way down, those bodies get broken apart. Bacteria decompose the tissue, small animals feed on the fragments, feces from surface creatures sinks continuously, shed skin cells, broken shells, fragments of every microscopic organism contribute to the descent. By the time all of this material has fallen a few hundred feet, it no longer looks like anything recognizable. It becomes a slow, steady drift of tiny particles descending through the water column. Scientists call this marine snow. Marine snow falls constantly and continuously from the sunlit zone toward the seafloor. The particles are small, most are less than 1 millimeter across, but together they carry the energy that keeps almost every deep-sea ecosystem alive. For creatures in the Hadal zone, 7 miles below the surface, marine snow is the only external food source available. There is nothing else coming down to them. The journey from the surface to the bottom of the Tonga Trench takes months for a single particle. Along the way, most of it gets intercepted and consumed by creatures in the shallower zones above. Only a small fraction of the original material, scientists estimate between 1% and 3% of what leaves the surface, actually reaches the sea floor of a deep trench. Yet deep trenches actually concentrate this material. The V-shape of the trench walls acts like a funnel. Falling particles drift sideways as they descend, and the converging walls guide more of them toward the narrow floor at the bottom than would settle on a flat, open seafloor at the same depth. This means the very deepest point of a trench receives more marine snow per square foot than the surrounding abyssal plain does. The trench is deep, and the trench is also an efficient collector. This concentrated food supply is part of what makes Hadal life possible. The creatures living there have evolved over millions of years to survive on almost nothing during the long periods between windfalls, then consume rapidly when something large, a dead whale, a piece of a large fish, a dense clump of organic debris, falls into their reach. Waiting and gorging, that is the Hadal strategy. The timing mismatch between surface production and Hadal arrival creates a feast or famine pattern at the bottom of the trench. When conditions at the surface are productive, spring blooms of phytoplankton, large congregations of surface animals, the marine snow rate increases, and months later the Hadal floor receives a pulse of extra food. Scientists sampling Hadal sediments have found evidence of these pulses preserved in the layering of organic material on the trench floor. The trench keeps a record of what was happening at the surface above it, written in chemistry and particle density rather than words. But the organisms that execute this strategy most successfully had to evolve biological solutions to problems that no creature at the surface ever faces. Scientists pulled the first Hadal snailfish up from a deep trench and spent a long moment just staring at it. It looks wrong. Its body is semi-transparent. You can see faint shapes of organs through its pale, gelatinous skin. It has no rigid scales. Its bones are thin and soft, almost unfinished, like a skeleton that never completed development. Its eyes are tiny and mostly useless in the permanent dark where it lives. It moves in slow, drifting curves, barely expending energy, coasting through the water like a leaf in a gentle wind. A snailfish looks like something designed by a committee that could not agree on what a fish should be, and that strange, unfinished appearance is exactly what makes it remarkable. The snailfish family holds the record for the deepest living vertebrate ever found on Earth. Members of this family have been recorded at depths exceeding 27,000 feet. They live in at least 9 different ocean trenches worldwide, including the Tonga Trench. They are the top predators in the Hadal food web, the apex animal in an ecosystem where almost nothing can survive. At the pressures that exist in the Hadal zone, the proteins inside a living cell cannot function normally. Pressure distorts the shape of protein molecules, and when proteins lose their shape, they lose their function. Enzymes stop working. Cell membranes become unstable. The entire molecular machinery of any living organism begins to fail under sufficient pressure. Snailfish have evolved a chemical solution to this problem. Their tissues accumulate high concentrations of a compound that acts as a pressure stabilizer. It essentially props up protein molecules under crushing force, maintaining their shape the way a scaffold holds up a building under repair. The deeper the snailfish lives, the more of this compound its body produces. Scientists studying snailfish genomes found that the genes responsible for producing this stabilizing compound show clear signs of strong evolutionary pressure over millions of years, meaning snailfish that produced more of it survived to reproduce, and those that produced less did not. The compound is not just helpful at Hadal depths. At those depths, it is the difference between functioning and dying. The snailfish is the top predator in the Hadal food web. In environments where almost nothing can survive, this soft, pale, gelatinous fish hunts. It eats amphipods, worms, and whatever else it can catch in the dark. At the bottom of the Tonga Trench, it is the king. The snailfish's position as top predator in the Hadal food web was initially surprising to scientists who expected such extreme conditions to support only simple, bottom-level organisms. Discovering a fish, a vertebrate with a spine, a brain, and active hunting behavior, thriving as the dominant animal in an environment that kills most biological structures on contact, changed the scientific community's working assumptions about the limits of complex life. If a vertebrate can survive at 7 miles depth, the question of where life absolutely cannot exist becomes harder to answer than it once seemed. Scientists studying the possibility of life on moons like Europa, thought to have a deep liquid ocean under miles of ice, point to the snailfish as evidence that complex animals can evolve under crushing pressure with no sunlight. The Hadal zone becomes, in that context, the closest thing on Earth to an extraterrestrial ocean. And there is a hard limit to how deep even the snailfish can go. The snailfish solution to deep-sea pressure is elegant, but it comes with a ceiling. The compound that stabilizes their proteins accumulates in higher and higher concentrations the deeper the fish lives. At moderate Hadal depths, the concentration is manageable. At extreme depths, it reaches levels that create their own biological problems. Too much of the compound can interfere with normal cell chemistry in other ways, introducing instability even as it resolves the pressure problem. Scientists studying snailfish genomes found that Hadal species carry multiple copies of the gene, controlling how much of the stabilizer the body produces. Having extra copies means the body can generate far more of it than any shallow water fish ever would. It is a genetic amplification of a survival chemical, layered into the genome over millions of years of adaptation. But there is still a hard limit. Researchers have not found any vertebrate, any fish, shark, or backboned animal of any kind, living deeper than around 27,000 feet. This depth is now considered the physiological ceiling for vertebrate life on Earth. Below it, even the maximum amount of the stabilizing compound a vertebrate body can safely accumulate is not enough to keep protein structure intact. The molecules begin to fail regardless. The fish cannot go deeper, no matter how evolved it is. The snailfish also made other body-level adaptations that help it survive. Its bones are thin and incompletely hardened. This means less rigid structure for pressure to crack or distort. Its skin is soft and gelatinous rather than armoured with rigid scales. Rigid structures break under extreme pressure gradients. Soft structures flex and survive. The snailfish body is built to yield rather than resist, surrendering to the pressure rather than fighting it. Its skull is incomplete, partially open at the top, rather than forming the closed rigid box that most fish skulls produce. Again, flexibility wins over rigidity at these depths. The ocean will find and crush anything that tries to hold its shape against the force. The snailfish also lost most of its pigmentation. In the permanent dark of the Hadal Zone, colour serves no purpose. There is nothing to see and nothing to be seen by. The genes responsible for producing skin pigment gradually became inactive over millions of years of living in total darkness, producing the pale, semi-transparent appearance that makes these fish look so strange when scientists bring one up into light for the first time. Every feature of the snailfish body tells the same story. This animal spent millions of years being shaped by an environment that eliminates everything that resists and keeps only what surrenders completely to pressure, darkness, and cold. The evolutionary timeline of the snailfish's deep-sea adaptation is also striking. Genetic analyses suggest that the Hadal snailfish diverged from their shallow water relatives only around 20 million years ago, which is recent in evolutionary terms. In 20 million years, a lineage of ordinary coastal fish evolved every feature needed to survive at the absolute pressure limit for vertebrate life on Earth. Transparent skin, soft bones, an open skull, and a suite of molecular adaptations that keep proteins functioning under 16,000 pounds per square inch. 20 million years of pressure shaped a fish that looks nothing like its ancestors. Below the snailfish in the food chain lives a creature that solved the deep-sea problem in an entirely different way and grew to sizes nobody predicted. Drop a baited trap to the bottom of the Tonga Trench and wait. Within hours, the camera attached to that trap will show movement in the darkness, then more movement, then dozens of creatures swarming the bait from every direction, drawn by the scent of food descending through cold, still water. Small at first, but when the exterior lights illuminate the scene clearly, the size of them stops scientists mid-sentence. Amphipods are crustaceans, distant relatives of shrimp. In the shallower ocean, they are tiny, typically less than an inch long. They live everywhere in the sea, from rocky tide pools to the open surface waters, and most people walking on a beach have stepped over thousands of them without noticing. In the Hadal Zone, they grow to the size of a human hand. One dominant species found in deep Pacific trenches, including the Tonga Trench, reaches lengths of nearly 14 inches. That is the length of a typical school ruler. Scientists call these animals giant amphipods, and their size is directly connected to the depth at which they live. The phenomenon is called deep-sea gigantism. Cold water slows metabolism, which means cells build up slowly and animals live longer, continuing to grow for more of that extended life. At Hadal depths, where temperatures stay near freezing permanently, animals that reach larger sizes before reproducing may also have physical advantages in competition for the scarce food that falls down from above. The exact mechanism is still studied and debated, but the pattern appears consistently across multiple deep-sea species in multiple trenches worldwide. In the Tonga Trench, researchers set baited traps at two separate sites, one near the very floor of the Horizon Deep and one on the trench wall at a somewhat shallower depth. At the bottom site, one species dominated overwhelmingly, the amphipod thriving at maximum pressure, in numbers 7 times greater than the trap at the shallower location recovered. More creatures at the deepest point, bigger creatures at the deepest point. The relationship between depth and amphipod abundance in this trench is exactly the opposite of what most people would intuitively predict. Scientists also consistently found that the deepest amphipods were larger than the individuals of the same species collected at the shallower site. Young amphipods tend to live at intermediate depths, and as they mature they move progressively deeper. The floor of the trench is where the adults live. A single sampling effort collected over 3,600 individual amphipods from 10 separate species. 7 of those species had never been recorded in the Tonga Trench before. The trench was already known to harbour these animals, but the true diversity of its amphipod community had simply never been fully documented. The amphipod story also highlights how much of the deep sea has simply never been sampled. For decades, the Tonga Trench was known to contain amphipods, and a handful of species had been collected and described. But those earlier samples came from a small number of deployments at a limited number of sites. When a more systematic effort went in, multiple traps, multiple sites, dedicated analysis, 7 species appeared that had never been documented there before. They were presumably always present. Scientists just had not looked carefully enough or in enough places to find them. The deep ocean is not a mystery because it holds nothing. It is a mystery because it holds far more than the handful of samples taken so far have revealed. And when the 2024 expedition arrived with months of time and more equipment than any previous team, the discoveries accelerated sharply. Between July and October of 2024, a team of scientists led by Professor Alan Jameson spent 3 months in the South Pacific doing something that had never been attempted at this scale at any ocean trench anywhere on Earth. Their research vessel, a ship called the Dagon, positioned itself over the Tonga Trench and began the most comprehensive scientific survey ever conducted at these depths. The expedition ran in 4 separate legs, working out of Nuku'alofa in the Kingdom of Tonga, with scientists rotating on and off the ship as each leg concluded. Equipment was deployed, retrieved, cleaned, and redeployed around the clock, 7 days a week. By the time the final leg ended in early October, the team had mapped over 64,000 square miles of seafloor using modern multi-beam sonar. That area is larger than the state of Georgia. They completed 104 separate lander deployments across 37 different sites, distributed along the length of the trench. They collected over 1,250 hours of video footage from the seafloor, more than 50 continuous days of recording, compressed into a 3-month expedition window. Each lander deployment meant lowering a heavily instrumented device from the surface ship, waiting for it to descend to the seafloor under its own weight, then waiting further for it to complete its recording or collection work, then triggering a release mechanism that dropped its ballast weight and allowed it to rise back to the surface. Some deployments covered round trips of nearly 14 miles top to bottom and back. A single round trip took most of a day. The expedition documented species from depths of around 3,000 feet, all the way down to the horizon deep at nearly 35,000 feet. Every zone of the trench, its upper walls, its mid-slopes, its floor, and its deepest point, was included in the survey for the first time in a single coordinated effort. The geological mapping data produced by the expedition was donated immediately to the global initiative working to chart the entire ocean floor by the year 2030, adding a major new section of high-resolution seafloor data to a project that has been building for years. The footage was sent back to researchers on land for processing and analysis, while the expedition was still underway. Discoveries started emerging within weeks. Creatures filmed on the lander cameras during individual deployments turned out to be rare or previously unseen in this location, and several sightings represented genuinely significant scientific records. The most dramatic encounters involved species that most marine biologists had only read about in published papers, animals that live in the deep ocean, but are filmed so rarely that each sighting is considered a meaningful scientific event in its own right. The logistics behind deploying scientific landers over and over at these depths without losing them deserves specific attention. Each lander carries acoustic transponders that allow the surface ship to communicate with it through the water column. When the ship sends a trigger signal, the lander releases its ballast weight, but acoustic signals in deep water can be scattered, absorbed, and distorted by temperature gradients and by the trench walls themselves. On some deployments, the signal needs to be sent multiple times before the lander responds. Scientists on the surface wait, track the transponder, and watch the data feed, knowing that if the lander does not respond and does not rise, it may be lost permanently at the bottom, along with everything it collected. One of those encounters happened on the upper walls of the trench, barely a mile below the surface, and it ended with the research camera inside a shark's mouth. The lander had been sitting at around 4,600 feet below the surface when the shape appeared at the edge of the frame. It came in slowly from the left, a dark mass resolving out of the blackness into something clearly large. The camera registered the surrounding water at around 37 degrees Fahrenheit. The bait attached to the lander had been drawing scavengers for hours before this moment. The Pacific sleeper shark moved toward the camera with the patient, unhurried confidence of an animal that has no natural predators at this depth. At around 12 feet long in this encounter, with the species known to reach up to 23 feet in length and weigh over 2,000 pounds, this shark is physically comparable to the largest great white sharks ever measured. But it operates in a completely different way. Great whites are explosive, fast, surface-zone predators built for speed and impact. The Pacific sleeper shark lives in the cold dark, moving slowly, conserving energy in an environment where food is scarce, and eating whatever it finds with patient efficiency. The camera footage, captured by the expedition team from the Minderoo University of Western Australia Deep Sea Research Centre, showed the shark approaching the lander directly and deliberately. Then it opened its mouth and took the camera in. For a brief moment, the footage showed the inside of the shark's mouth, its teeth, the dark interior, the roof of its jaw, before the shark realized the camera was not food and released it. Then the shark turned toward the actual bait attached nearby. Researcher Jessica Kolbers, watching the footage, noted the sequence with a simple observation. The shark went straight for the camera first, investigating it as a potential meal, then pivoted to the bait once it determined the camera was inedible. In an environment where food can be rare and unpredictable, Pacific sleeper sharks investigate everything that might be a calorie. These sharks are adapted to survive at depths far beyond what most shark species can manage. Their bodies handle cold temperatures and pressure in ways scientists continue to study. Their diet is extremely wide: fish, squid, octopus, crabs, prawns, and carrion of any kind. In environments with almost no food, dietary flexibility is a critical survival advantage. The Pacific sleeper shark's ability to survive at 4,000 feet raises questions scientists are still examining about how deep ocean sharks regulate their body chemistry. At that depth and temperature, standard shark physiology, which is already distinct from most fish due to the way sharks manage salt and fluid balance, faces additional pressure-related challenges. Some researchers believe sleeper sharks may use biological stabilizing mechanisms similar in principle to what snailfish use, although the specific chemistry differs. How many other large predators have quietly evolved deep water tolerance without scientists ever having deployed a camera long enough and deep enough to catch them in the act is genuinely unknown. The encounter happened at around 4,600 feet, far above the actual floor of the Tonga Trench, which drops to over 35,000 feet. The sleeper shark does not descend to the absolute bottom, but what does reach the absolute bottom, and what the 2024 cameras captured there, belongs to a completely different category of strange. In September of 2024, a lander camera sitting at nearly 11,000 feet below the surface of the Tonga Trench recorded something materializing out of the darkness. It moved into frame slowly. First the body, small and compact, not immediately remarkable. Then the arms came into view, 26 feet of thin, trailing tentacles extending from a body no bigger than a football. The arms reached out sideways and downward, touching the seafloor, feeling across the surface in a motion that looked almost like fingers searching carefully in the dark for something they could not quite locate. The bigfin squid belongs to a group of cephalopods that scientists have seen fewer than 20 times across all of recorded history. Its arms are so long relative to its body that the proportions look physically wrong, like something designed by someone who had only heard a description of what a squid is supposed to look like. Those arms are also thought to be covered in adhesive structures. The squid may press them flat against the seafloor and wait passively for small organisms to stick, rather than chasing prey through the water the way most squid hunt. This sighting in the Tonga Trench was the first time this type of squid had ever been documented in this part of the ocean. The species had been encountered at depth in other locations, but the Tonga sighting pushed its confirmed range significantly southward and confirmed that it can live at depths approaching 35,000 feet, a depth range that places it among the most extreme inhabitants of the Hadal Zone. The footage shows the squid pausing after it enters the camera frame. Then it appears to tug at something at the edge of the shot. Possibly one of its adhesive arms had attached to the lander frame or the seafloor. It tugs, frees itself, and then rises upward and out of frame, disappearing into the darkness above. Alan Jameson, the lead scientist on the expedition, described the encounter as unexpected. Big fin squid sightings typically happen by accident during expeditions focused on something else entirely. Nobody plans to film one. They appear on camera by chance, they are recorded, and then they are gone before anyone can redirect other instruments toward them. The species was only formally described by scientists in the 1980s, despite these animals clearly inhabiting multiple ocean basins worldwide. That timeline is worth pausing on. A squid with 26-foot arms has been living in the deep ocean for an unknown number of millions of years, and science only officially acknowledged its existence around 40 years ago. Scientists watching the Tonga footage noted a detail in the final seconds before the squid disappears upward. The trailing edges of its body pulse with a faint rhythmic pattern, possibly bioluminescence, possibly a communication signal, possibly something else entirely that has no name yet because no one has watched enough big fin squid to understand what that pulse means. Nobody knows what the squid was doing. Nobody knows where it went. Nobody knows how many of them inhabit the Tonga Trench. And the big fin squid is only one of several creatures the 2024 cameras captured that science still cannot fully explain. The whiplash squid was another, a creature found at 3,000 feet in the trench, with two long, trailing tentacles moving like slow whips through the water. Scientists know it exists. They know almost nothing else. How it reproduces, how long it lives, what it eats, all unknown. The Tonga Trench is a place where things live that science has barely begun to describe. It emerged from the darkness slowly, and at first the camera almost missed it. The shape was thin, almost too thin to register as an animal. Two trailing tentacles extended behind a small, compact body, drifting with a slow, hypnotic rhythm that looked nothing like the fast, darting movements most people associate with squid. Then the fin along its body began to pulse, gentle, steady, wave-like. And the tentacles, each one stretching several times the length of the body itself, swept through the water in long, trailing arcs. This was the whiplash squid. And the 2024 Tonga Trench expedition filmed it at around 3,000 feet below the surface. The whiplash squid belongs to a family of deep-sea squid known for two extremely long, slender tentacles that trail behind the body like a pair of slow-motion whips. The family has a common nickname that captures a different side of its appearance, the loveheart squid, because of its small, heart-shaped fin that pulses constantly as the animal moves. The fin does not propel the squid at speed. It seems designed for gentle, controlled drifting rather than any kind of fast escape. Scientists studying what whiplash squid actually eat faced an immediate problem. Observing them feeding in the wild is extremely difficult. Instead, researchers in earlier studies analysed the stomach contents of individuals caught off the coast of New Zealand to figure out what was inside. The results were surprising. The contents suggested whiplash squid are opportunistic, taking whatever they can find rather than specialising in a single prey type. In an environment where food is unpredictable and sparse, that flexibility matters enormously. The two long trailing tentacles are thought to play a role in feeding, though exactly how is still debated. Some researchers believe the squid uses them as passive sensors, trailing them through the water and detecting vibrations or contact from small prey. Others suggest the tentacles may actively sweep through patches of small organisms. The tentacles are so thin that they're nearly invisible in low-light footage, which means researchers watching video footage often do not realise the full extent of the animal until the camera angle shifts. Deep-sea squid like this one are also subject to the same size pressures that affect amphipods and other hadal creatures. In cold, deep water, metabolism slows and growth continues for longer periods. Whether the whiplash squid's extraordinarily long tentacles represent a form of deep-sea gigantism applied specifically to their appendages, rather than their whole body, is an open question. The 2024 sighting in the Tonga Trench added a new location to the known range of this family, and provided footage that scientists are still analysing. The way the squid moved, the slow pulse of its fin, the trailing sweep of its tentacles, the complete absence of any hurry, looked unlike almost any other marine predator. It looked patient, like something that had learned to wait rather than chase. In the deep ocean, where a meal might appear once every few days and disappear before you can react, waiting is a survival strategy just as valid as speed. Something else found in the Tonga Trench also relies entirely on patience and timing, and what it does when a meal finally arrives is one of the most spectacular feeding events in the entire ocean. In the deep ocean, death is a gift. When a large marine animal, a whale, a shark, a giant sea turtle, dies near the surface, its body begins to sink. The descent takes hours or days depending on the size of the carcass and the depth of the water. Bacteria begin breaking down the tissue immediately. Oils seep from the flesh and rise, leaving a faint chemical trail in the water column above. In the Hadal zone, organisms detect these chemical signals from miles away. A whale carcass sinking toward the Tonga Trench floor does not arrive unnoticed. Long before it reaches the bottom, amphipods begin moving toward the scent. Snailfish sense disturbances in the water. By the time the carcass settles on the seafloor, a feeding event has already started. Scientists call this a whale fall, and a single whale fall can sustain an entire ecosystem for decades. A large whale carcass carries an enormous amount of biological material: fat, muscle, bone, organ tissue. At the surface, a dead whale feeds seabirds and surface scavengers for days before sinking. But at the bottom of a deep trench, where food is desperately scarce and organisms cannot afford to waste anything, that same carcass becomes a long-term resource. The process happens in stages. First come the mobile scavengers, the amphipods, the snailfish, the hagfish-like creatures that consume soft tissue rapidly. These organisms strip the flesh from the bones in a matter of months. On the surface, this stage would take days. At Hadal depths, with far fewer scavengers, the stripping process is slower but thorough. Then come the enrichment opportunists, organisms that colonize the bones and surrounding sediment while nutrients still leach out of the carcass. Worms, small crustaceans and microbial mats cover the remaining structure. This stage lasts years. Finally come the sulfophilic bacteria. As the oils and fats deep inside the bones slowly break down, they release hydrogen sulfide, the same gas that makes rotten eggs smell rotten. These bacteria consume the hydrogen sulfide and produce energy from it in a process called chemosynthesis. This is the same process that powers life around hydrothermal vents, where no sunlight ever reaches. A whale skeleton on the seafloor becomes, in its final years of decomposition, a miniature chemosynthetic ecosystem. Animals that normally live only around deep-sea vents colonize the bones. A single large whale can fuel this full cycle for up to 100 years. One animal's death sustains a community that would otherwise have almost nothing. Scientists studying deep-sea trenches believe whale falls may function as stepping stones, biological oases scattered across the otherwise food-poor seafloor that allow some species to spread between isolated trench ecosystems. Without them, the distances between food sources in the deep would be far too great for many organisms to cross. The Tonga Trench sits in a region of the Pacific with significant whale populations at the surface above it, which means whale falls into this trench are not rare events. Scientists have also found that whale falls in deep trenches function differently from those on shallower seafloors. At Hadal depths, the cold slows every stage of decomposition. The mobile scavenger stage that would last days or weeks at shallow depths can last months in the Tonga Trench. The enrichment opportunist stage stretches from years to decades. The sulfophilic chemosynthesis stage, which might run for decades on a shallower carcass, can extend far longer in deep cold. A whale that dies and sinks into the Tonga Trench today may still be feeding organisms at its bones a century from now. But the smallest organisms at the bottom of this trench may be the strangest ones of all. If you dropped a handful of soil into a blender, pureed it, and looked at the result under a powerful microscope, you would find roundworms. You would find them in enormous numbers. These tiny, thread-thin creatures live in almost every environment on Earth. Soil, fresh water, salt water, hot springs, polar ice. Scientists estimate that roughly 60% of all animals on Earth by individual count are roundworms. They're also, as it turns out, thriving at the very bottom of the Tonga Trench. Roundworms are the dominant animal at the horizon deep. Scientists coring the sediment at the deepest point of the trench and examining it under magnification found dense populations of these microscopic animals living in the top layers of the seafloor mud. Their abundance at the very bottom was measured at 6 times the density found partway up the trench wall at a shallower site. 6 times more worms at the deepest, most extreme point. Scientists have proposed several competing explanations for why this happens, and none has been fully confirmed. One idea is the funnel effect. The V-shape of the trench walls concentrates falling marine snow toward the floor, delivering more food per square foot at the bottom than at the shallower edges. More food means more organisms can survive there. Roundworms, which feed on bacteria and decaying organic material, would benefit directly from this concentration of nutrients. Another idea involves predator pressure. At intermediate depths on the trench wall, more species compete for space and food. Larger predators pick off smaller organisms. The very bottom of the trench may be a refuge, too deep for many predators, too extreme for most competitors, where roundworms face less pressure and can build larger populations than they could in a more crowded environment. A third possibility involves the sediment itself. Deep trench sediment accumulates for millions of years, building up organic material slowly. The sediment at the horizon deep is ancient and rich, in the specific way that deep ocean sediment becomes rich, not with large food items, but with the fine residue of everything that has ever fallen down from above over geological time. Roundworms are specialists at extracting energy from exactly this kind of material. The honest scientific answer is that all 3 factors probably contribute, and possibly others that have not been identified yet. What makes the roundworm finding matter beyond pure biology is what it tells scientists about the limits of animal life. Roundworms are some of the simplest animals on Earth in terms of body plan. They have been found in gold mines more than 2 miles underground, living in ancient water trapped in rock. Finding them at the bottom of the Tonga Trench adds another extreme to the list of places these animals have conquered. The roundworm finding also has implications for how scientists think about life distribution in deep trenches worldwide. If the same density pattern, more individuals at greater depth, holds across multiple trenches and multiple species, it suggests that something systematic about the deep trench environment favours population build-up rather than suppression. The funnel hypothesis would explain this across all trenches with similar V-shaped geometry. Testing that prediction requires detailed sampling from multiple trenches at matched depths, which is exactly the kind of comparative work that the 2024 Tonga expedition was partly designed to enable. Every time scientists look carefully at the deep ocean, they find more life than they expected. The expectation keeps getting revised upward, and the creatures at the surface of the trench sediment are just the ones visible to a camera. What lives deeper in the mud is a different story entirely. Most people picture the deep ocean as silent. The reality is stranger. The deep ocean is not quiet. It is filled with sound, but with sound that operates by completely different rules than the noise of the surface world. Water conducts sound roughly 4 times faster than air does. At the surface, sound travels at around 750 miles per hour. In cold, deep ocean water, it moves closer to 3,400 miles per hour. This means that sounds made in one part of the ocean can travel enormous distances before they fade. Deep in the ocean, there is a layer where temperature and pressure combine in a specific way that traps sound and channels it horizontally rather than letting it scatter in all directions. Scientists call this layer the deep sound channel. Sounds entering this layer can travel thousands of miles with very little loss. Whale calls recorded in the deep sound channel have been detected on the other side of entire ocean basins. Scientists lowered acoustic recording equipment into the Tonga Trench on one early expedition to document what the trench actually sounds like at depth. The recordings captured something researchers did not fully expect. The trench is not uniformly quiet. The geological activity of the region generates low-frequency rumbles. Water movements create subtle acoustic signatures, distant sounds from the surface world, ship engines, biological calls from marine animals far above, even the faint acoustic signature of breaking waves, penetrate down into the trench. The deep ocean is always listening in both directions. What the recordings also captured was the absence of certain sounds. The ambient noise of the trench is fundamentally different from any ocean environment closer to the surface. The constant mid-frequency hum generated by shipping traffic, which now blankets much of the upper ocean worldwide, fades with depth. At Hadal depths, that human-made noise floor drops significantly. Scientists studying the acoustic environment of deep trenches believe this matters for the organisms living there, animals that use sound to communicate, to detect prey, or to operate in an acoustic environment shaped entirely by geology, biology, and physics, with minimal interference from the surface world. One of the most dramatic acoustic events ever recorded in this region came not from the trench itself, but from the 2022 volcanic eruption above it. Hydrophones positioned in the Pacific, instruments designed to detect underwater sound, recorded the eruption as a massive broadband acoustic event that propagated through the ocean water column simultaneously, with the atmospheric pressure waves circling the planet above. The trench was shaken by sound from both directions at once, from the sky and from the water, simultaneously. The long-range acoustic travel in the deep ocean has also changed how scientists monitor geological events in remote places. Rather than relying entirely on seismic networks on land, researchers can place hydrophones in the deep sound channel and use them to detect submarine volcanic eruptions, landslides, and even large whale movements thousands of miles from the nearest monitoring station. The Tonga region, with its extreme geological activity and relative remoteness from land-based monitoring, is exactly the kind of environment where ocean-based acoustic monitoring fills critical gaps in the global network. No instrument inside the trench recorded what that moment sounded like at the horizon deep. That data does not exist. But the equipment lost on the final deployment of that early expedition, the camera that never came back up, makes scientists wonder what sound reached the bottom that day. Science at the Tonga Trench has always operated at the edge of what is physically possible. Every instrument sent to the horizon deep is a gamble. The pressure at those depths is not something any standard scientific equipment survives. Every lander, every camera housing, every collection bottle, every pressure sensor has to be engineered specifically for the task, tested, certified, and sent down with the knowledge that a single flaw in the design could mean losing everything. On one of the earlier expeditions to the Tonga Trench, a science team deployed a baited camera system multiple times over several days. The setup was a standard deep-sea lander, a weighted frame carrying cameras and collection bottles, designed to sink under its own weight, sit on the bottom, collect footage and samples, then release its ballast and float back up. The first 3 deployments went as planned. The lander went down, sat in the dark at the bottom of the trench for hours, then ascended and was recovered at the surface. The footage from those first 3 trips included some of the clearest early video ever captured at Tonga Trench depths. Scientists on the ship were encouraged. They wanted one more deployment, the deepest and longest of the trip. The lander went down. Hours passed. The team waited. Then they sent the acoustic signal to release the ballast weight and begin the ascent. Nothing happened. They sent the signal again. Silence from the acoustic transponder. The lander was gone. The team's best explanation was pressure failure. The collection bottles attached to the lander had a rated depth limit. On the final deployment sent deeper and left longer than the previous 3, the bottles likely exceeded that limit and collapsed. The implosion may have damaged the rest of the system, the release mechanism, the transponder, the camera housing, leaving the entire instrument sitting permanently on the seafloor with whatever footage it had captured. That footage, from what would have been the deepest and most valuable deployment of the entire expedition, no longer exists in any accessible form. It is sitting in the dark at the bottom of the Tonga Trench, inside a crushed metal frame, recording nothing. Scientists who work in the deep sea accept this as part of the work. Equipment loss is not rare. Every deep sea program budgets for it. But the particular loss on that expedition, a final deployment designed specifically to push deeper than the previous ones, carrying bait intended to attract whatever lives at maximum depth, hit the team as more than just a practical setback. The specific footage they lost was potentially irreplaceable. Whatever the camera saw in those final hours before the system failed, nobody will ever know. Getting anything from the deepest places on Earth requires accepting that sometimes the ocean keeps what it is shown. The loss of deep-sea equipment is also a scientific problem with legal and logistical dimensions. Instruments abandoned on the seafloor do not belong to the ocean. They belong to the scientific institution or government agency that deployed them, which creates questions about liability and environmental responsibility, even at depths nobody can access. A growing conversation in the oceanographic community concerns how to design deep-sea instruments that are more reliably retrievable, and what happens when they are not. The seafloor of the world's deep trenches now holds an unknown number of lost scientific instruments, carrying data that will never be read. But other things that have been carried into the deep ocean were never scientific instruments at all. 5 feet of mud from 30,000 feet below the ocean's surface is surprisingly difficult to handle. On an early Tonga Trench expedition, scientists used specialized coring equipment to pull cylindrical tubes of seafloor sediment up from the deepest part of the trench. Each core was 5 feet long, packed with dark mud that had been accumulating on the trench floor for millions of years. The mud smelled strongly of sulfur, the byproduct of microbial activity happening inside it, and the moment those cores were brought onto the ship deck, a clock started ticking. The microbes living in that mud were adapted to 2 very specific conditions: near freezing temperature and extreme pressure. Bring the mud to the surface, where the pressure is 1 atmosphere and the temperature is whatever the air is that day, and the microbes begin dying almost immediately. Their cell membranes, tuned to function under thousands of pounds per square inch, fail at surface pressure. Their enzymes, adapted to work near freezing, malfunction in warmer air. Scientists had to store the cores immediately in pressure vessels, containers that could maintain the crushing pressure of the deep ocean, and keep those vessels refrigerated to preserve the microbes in the state they needed to survive. All of this had to happen within minutes of the cores reaching the deck. The organisms living in the deep trench sediment operate on timescales that surface life does not. In the cold, nutrient-poor mud, metabolic rates are so slow that a single bacterial cell may divide only once every few thousand years. Scientists have found microbes in deep ocean sediment that appear to have been metabolically active, alive but barely, for millions of years. They are not frozen in time. They are just living at a pace so slow that human timescales become nearly meaningless. Studying these organisms requires techniques that were largely invented for this purpose. Standard microbiology assumes that bacteria grow quickly enough to culture in a laboratory within days or weeks. Deep trench microbes may take decades to show measurable growth under laboratory conditions. Some have never been successfully cultured at all. Scientists can detect their DNA in sediment samples and know they exist, but cannot yet grow them in any laboratory setting. What these microbes do in the sediment matters beyond biology. They are performing chemical reactions that affect the chemistry of the entire ocean over geological time, processing organic material, cycling nitrogen and sulfur, transforming compounds that eventually influence the water chemistry of waters far above them. The mud at the bottom of the Tonga Trench is not inert. It is alive slowly, in ways that connect everything. The practical implications of deep trench microbiology extend to carbon accounting as well. The organic material processed by these deep microbes represents carbon that has been removed from the surface carbon cycle. Understanding how efficiently microbes at trench depths consume and transform organic carbon, how much they respire back as carbon dioxide and how much they convert into stable compounds that remain buried in the sediment, feeds directly into global models of the ocean's role in the long-term carbon cycle. The bottom of the Tonga Trench is connected to the chemistry of the atmosphere above it in ways scientists are still mapping. And some of what has been introduced into this deep mud from the surface above it was never supposed to be there at all. In August of 2002, 2 earthquakes struck in quick succession in the deep Tonga subduction zone. They measured at magnitudes of 7.6 and 7.7. They occurred at depths that most seismologists still find difficult to fully explain. The quakes happened hundreds of miles underground, far below the depth where standard earthquake physics says brittle rock fracture should be possible. At those depths, the temperature and pressure should have turned the rock surrounding the descending slab into something more like very slow-moving putty than the rigid, breakable material that generates seismic events. Yet both earthquakes produced clear, strong seismic signatures that instruments around the world detected within minutes of the events. The second quake was dynamically triggered by the first. The seismic waves from the initial event travelled through the rock and triggered the release of stress that had been building in a nearby section of the slab. Dynamic triggering of earthquakes is not unheard of at shallow depths, but documenting it happening at several hundred miles underground added a new dimension to what seismologists understand about how stress transfers in deep, cold rock. These deep focus earthquakes also behave differently on the surface than shallow ones do. The energy from a deep quake spreads out over a much larger area by the time it reaches the surface, producing lower peak shaking at any single point but affecting a wider region. A magnitude 7 event at 700 miles depth causes far less localized damage than a magnitude 7 event at 10 miles depth, but it can be felt across an area the size of a continent. Scientists continue debating what physical mechanism actually produces these deep focus earthquakes. One leading idea involves mineral phase changes. As the subducting slab descends and pressure increases, certain minerals inside the rock transform into denser crystal structures, releasing energy in the process. Another idea involves dehydration. Water locked into minerals in the descending slab gets squeezed out as pressure increases, and that released water changes the mechanical properties of the surrounding rock enough to allow fracture. A third hypothesis involves the slab remaining cold enough in its interior to maintain brittle rock behavior far deeper than the surrounding mantle temperature would allow. All three mechanisms probably contribute. None alone explains the full pattern of deep earthquakes recorded at Tonga. What makes this frustrating and exciting simultaneously is that the Tonga subduction zone produces these events more frequently and at greater depth than any other location on Earth. It is the best natural laboratory for studying them. But natural laboratories do not run controlled experiments. They produce events on their own schedule, at their own depths, in their own configurations. The Tonga Trench will generate more deep focus earthquakes this year. Some will be large enough to record clearly. Scientists will analyse every one, and the pattern will still not be fully explained by the end of the analysis. The practical stakes of understanding deep focus earthquakes extend well beyond academic seismology. Scientists who understand the mechanism behind these events can better model how stress accumulates and transfers along the entire Tonga subduction zone, from the deepest slab earthquakes to the shallow, tsunami-genic events near the surface. If deep seismicity patterns change, if the rate or location of deep earthquakes shifts, that change could signal evolving conditions on the fault that affect hazard estimates for the shallow earthquakes and tsunamis that reach the surface and affect human communities. Deep earthquakes, invisible on the surface, influence the hazard calculus for everything above them. And on the surface, above all of this seismic activity, the trench has sent waves across entire oceans more than once. On September 29, 2009, the ocean off the northern coast of the Tonga Trench lurched. A magnitude 8.1 earthquake struck at the edge of the subduction zone, the outer trench slope where the Pacific Plate bends downward as it begins its dive. The seafloor moved, water above it displaced. A tsunami formed and began spreading outward in all directions. The waves reached the coast of Samoa within 15 minutes. The communities there had almost no warning. The tsunami killed around 190 people across Samoa, American Samoa and Tonga, one of the deadliest Pacific tsunamis in decades at the time it occurred. The Tonga subduction zone has generated major regional tsunamis in recorded history going back to 1865. Events in 1885, 1929, and 2009 caused significant damage and casualties across the island nations of the region. The 2022 volcanic eruption above the trench produced tsunamis from a different mechanism, volcanic collapse and submarine explosion rather than pure earthquake displacement, and those waves travelled even further. The physics that makes the Tonga zone so dangerous for tsunamis comes directly from the same properties that make it geologically extreme. The fast plate convergence rate means large amounts of stored elastic energy accumulate quickly along the fault. When that energy releases in a major earthquake, the seafloor displacement is large. Large displacement means large initial wave height. And because the Tonga Trench runs roughly north to south, along a long, relatively straight axis, earthquakes along its length can generate waves that spread broadly across the entire southwestern Pacific. The island communities of Tonga, Samoa, American Samoa, Fiji, and Vanuatu all sit within the potential impact zone of a large Tonga-generated tsunami. Scientists studying the region's tsunami history have identified evidence of much larger events in the geological past. Tsunami deposits in coastal sediments that record waves far larger than anything in the written historical record. The largest tsunamis in the prehistorical record from this region appear to have been generated by combinations of factors. large earthquakes triggering submarine landslides, which then added their own water displacement to the earthquake-generated wave. The steep walls of the Tonga Trench, laden with sediment that periodically destabilizes when shaken, represent a potential trigger for exactly this kind of compound event. Modern warning systems in the Pacific have improved dramatically since 2009. Buoys that detect pressure changes from passing tsunamis now dot the Pacific basin and can alert coastal communities within minutes. But for the nearest communities to the Tonga Trench, the travel time for a locally generated tsunami is so short that a warning system can only do so much. The 2022 event reminded scientists and emergency planners of another problem. The volcanic tsunami generated that day travelled faster than predicted models for standard earthquake tsunamis, and it arrived at some coastlines before alerts could be fully distributed. A fast-moving trench with multiple ways to generate tsunamis, earthquake, volcanic eruption, submarine landslide, or combination, demands monitoring systems built for every possible trigger simultaneously. Scientists have also studied the pattern of which sections of the Tonga Fault tend to produce large earthquakes versus which sections appear locked and accumulating stress without releasing it. The fast convergence rate means stress builds quickly everywhere along the fault. But not all sections rupture at the same frequency. Some appear to release stress in many smaller events. Others go quiet for extended periods before producing a large rupture. Identifying which sections are in which mode, and how that changes over time, is a central goal of the monitoring programs focused on the Tonga subduction zone. None of those systems existed fully on January 15, 2022. When the Tonga eruption detonated on January 15, 2022, the tsunami it generated was not a standard wave. A typical earthquake-generated tsunami is created by a sudden vertical movement of the seafloor that displaces the column of water above it. The wave then spreads outward as a relatively slow disturbance in the ocean, taking minutes to travel from the epicenter to the nearest shores. Scientists tracking these waves use well-established models built on decades of data. The Tonga tsunami broke those models in ways scientists are still analyzing. The eruption generated multiple types of wave disturbance simultaneously. There was a standard water tsunami from the collapse of material into the sea around the eruption site. There was also an entirely different kind of wave, a so-called meteor tsunami, generated by the atmospheric pressure wave moving through the sky above the ocean. As the LAM wave raced outward from the eruption site at the speed of sound, the sudden change in atmospheric pressure above the ocean surface pushed the water below it, generating a wave that moved faster than any earthquake tsunami could. This atmospheric component travelled across the Pacific at around 750 miles per hour, the speed of sound in air. Earthquake tsunamis typically move at around 500 miles per hour in deep ocean water. The Tonga atmospheric wave was travelling faster than a standard tsunami can. When this wave reached distant coastlines, Japan, the United States West Coast, Chile, Peru, it arrived earlier than the conventional tsunami models predicted. In some locations, the atmospheric wave arrived before the water wave, essentially preloading the harbour with a pressure disturbance that made the subsequent water wave more destructive. In Peru, the combination caused harbour waves large enough to capsize fishing vessels and trigger an oil spill. Scientists studying the event afterward found that no existing operational tsunami warning model had accounted for this kind of atmospheric-driven wave propagation. The system was not designed for it because this specific mechanism, a volcanic eruption generating both a standard water tsunami and an atmospheric pressure tsunami simultaneously, had never been observed at this scale in the modern monitoring era. The 2022 Tonga event produced a body of scientific data that researchers will be analysing for years. Papers studying the atmospheric dynamics, the oceanographic wave propagation, the ionospheric disturbances, and the long-range tsunami effects are still being published. Each one adds a piece to the understanding of what happened that morning and what it means for future monitoring of this volcanic zone. The eruption also reshaped the island above the trench substantially. When satellite imaging finally cleared enough ash and cloud cover to get a clear view several weeks after the eruption, scientists saw that the volcanic island itself had largely disappeared. What remained was a different arrangement of rock and ash, smaller, lower, and still steaming. The difference between the water-based tsunami and the atmospheric-driven wave from the 2022 eruption also matters for how early warning systems are designed going forward. Standard Pacific tsunami warning systems are built around detecting seafloor pressure changes from earthquake-generated waves, a technology that works well for the threats it was designed to detect. The atmospheric LAM wave that drove part of the 2022 tsunami moved through the sky, not the ocean floor, and existing detection buoys were not monitoring for it. Building warning systems that can detect atmospheric wave coupling, the mechanism that drove early arriving waves to distant coastlines, requires adding new sensor types to a network that was not designed with volcanic tsunamis as its primary threat. Above a trench that generated one of the most energetic geological events in recorded history, the surface landscape had been rewritten. The islands of Tonga did not always exist. They were built by the same geological machine that carved the trench beneath them. As the Pacific Plate dives beneath the Indo-Australian Plate, along the Tonga subduction zone, it carries rock and sediment down toward the hot mantle below. The descending plate heats up and releases water locked into its minerals. That water lowers the melting point of the surrounding mantle rock. Rock that should be solid at those temperatures begins to melt. The melted rock, less dense than the surrounding material, rises. Eventually it erupts. Directly above the subduction zone, a chain of volcanoes has been building for millions of years. The Tonga volcanic arc contains more than 30 active or recently active volcanoes, many of them entirely underwater. The volcanoes that break the ocean surface form the visible islands of Tonga. The ones that remain submerged form the longest chain of underwater volcanoes on Earth. The relationship between the trench and the volcanic arc is precise and predictable. The trench runs along a nearly straight line from north to south. The arc of volcanoes sits parallel to it, displaced slightly to the west, at exactly the distance corresponding to the depth at which the descending Pacific Plate releases enough water and heat to trigger melting in the mantle above it. Move the subduction zone and the arc moves with it. Change the angle of subduction and the arc shifts position accordingly. Scientists use this relationship to calculate properties of the descending slab that they cannot directly observe. By measuring exactly where volcanoes form above a subduction zone and what chemical signatures their eruptions carry, researchers can work backward to determine how deep the slab was when it released the melted material, and what the slab's internal temperature and composition must be at that depth. The Tonga Arc is one of the most chemically studied volcanic systems in the Pacific specifically, because the fast subduction rate here creates a cleaner, more extreme version of the processes that happen more slowly elsewhere. It is a natural experiment running at high speed, but volcanic arcs are also dangerous in ways that trenches are not directly. The 2022 eruption was the most visible reminder. A volcano in an arc above a subduction zone does not erupt predictably or on a schedule that scientists can reliably forecast. The same volcanic system that built the Tonga Islands over millions of years can destroy a significant part of one of those islands in a single morning. The 30 active volcanoes sitting above the Tonga subduction zone are being fed continuously by the heat and water released from the descending Pacific Plate below. The plate is not slowing down, the heat is not decreasing, the volcanoes are not going dormant. The chemistry of Tonga Arc volcanic eruptions also provides direct information about what the descending Pacific Plate is made of and what happens to it as it sinks. Different elements and isotopes are released from the slab at different depths and temperatures. By analysing the exact chemical signature of Tonga volcanic rocks and comparing them with models of what the slab composition should be, scientists can reconstruct the thermal and chemical history of the Pacific Plate as it descended to its current depth below the volcanic arc. The islands of Tonga are, in this sense, a geological readout of what is happening to the ocean floor 7 miles below the trench's surface. And underneath all of them, the trench is also slowly being reshaped by something unusual happening at its southern end. At the southern end of the Tonga Trench, something unusual is happening to the subduction zone itself. A chain of underwater mountains, a seamount chain called the Louisville Seamount Chain, is approaching the trench from the east. This chain of ancient volcanic peaks formed over a hotspot in the Pacific Mantle millions of years ago, in the same way that the Hawaiian Islands formed over the hotspot beneath the Pacific in the Northern Hemisphere. The Louisville chain stretches for hundreds of miles across the Pacific floor, a long line of submerged peaks rising thousands of feet above the surrounding seafloor. The Pacific Plate is carrying this mountain chain westward toward the Tonga Trench at 9 inches per year, and the mountains are arriving. When a seamount reaches a subduction zone, it does not simply slide smoothly beneath the overriding plate. Seamounts are large, rigid, three-dimensional objects. They do not compress or fold easily. As each peak reaches the trench and begins to descend, it tears into the overriding plate, gouging out material, disrupting the geometry of the subduction zone, and creating chaos in the normally smooth process of one plate sliding beneath the other. The Louisville collision zone is currently migrating southward along the Tonga Trench at around 11 inches per year, faster than the plate convergence rate, because the angle of the Louisville chain relative to the direction of subduction causes the contact point to move along the trench axis over time. This migration has left observable scars. At the section of the trench where the Louisville seamounts are currently subducting, the trench is shallower than it is to the north. The seamounts are physically propping open the gap between the plates, preventing the trench from reaching the depths it achieves further up the axis. Scientists studying the bathymetric maps of the trench can see exactly where the seamount chain is interfering with the subduction geometry. The disruption also affects the earthquakes in the region. Sections of the trench where seamounts are subducting tend to produce a different pattern of seismicity, more frequent, smaller events, rather than the occasional large ruptures that characterize the smoother sections of the fault. The seamount creates mechanical complexity in the fault zone that distributes stress differently. In geological time, the Louisville seamount chain will continue marching into the trench. Each successive peak will arrive, disrupt the subduction, and eventually be swallowed into the mantle. The peaks are being destroyed one by one as they collide with the edge of the plate and sink. What is being swallowed has been building for millions of years. What swallows it has been building for even longer. The disruption caused by subducting seamounts also has implications for tsunami hazard. When a large, rigid seamount grinds against the overriding plate as it descends, it can destabilize the seafloor above it, causing submarine landslides or sudden displacement events that generate localized tsunamis. Scientists studying historical tsunami records in the Tonga region have found some events that do not match the pattern expected from pure fault ruptures, and subducting seamounts interacting with the overriding plate are one candidate explanation. The Louisville seamount chain's slow arrival at the southern end of the Tonga Trench means this mechanism is active and ongoing. And while all of this geological violence plays out, the bottom of the trench remains, strangely, one of the cleanest deep ocean environments on Earth. In the 2010s, scientists began systematically examining deep ocean trenches for human pollution. The results from the Mariana Trench were immediate and disturbing. Amphipods collected from the very bottom of the deepest point in the ocean contained microplastic fibers in their digestive systems. The plastics were not trace contamination, they were abundant. Some of the amphipods had multiple fibers in their guts. Scientists identified the materials: nylon, rayon, polyethylene, the kind of synthetic materials used in clothing, fishing lines, food packaging, and hundreds of other everyday products. The Kermadec Trench, south of the Tonga Trench, showed similarly high contamination. Trenches in the Northwest Pacific, the Japan Trench, the Mariana, the Izubonin, all showed it. Researchers looking at the pattern recognized what was happening. Ocean trenches function as collection points. Marine snow carries microplastic particles down from the surface along with organic debris. The funnel shape of the trench concentrates them at the bottom. The amphipods and other scavengers eat whatever falls, including plastics they cannot distinguish from food. Researchers then examined the Tonga Trench. The results were different. Early sampling at the Tonga Trench found dramatically lower contamination levels than at any of the other major deep trenches studied. In some analyses, the Tonga Trench appeared effectively pristine, among the cleanest deep-sea environments examined in the entire survey. Scientists proposed several explanations. The Tonga Trench sits in a relatively remote section of the Pacific, far from the highly populated coastlines that generate the most plastic pollution. The major ocean current systems around the Tonga region do not funnel surface pollution into this zone as efficiently as currents deliver pollution to trenches in the northern Pacific. The island nations of Tonga themselves generate relatively small amounts of plastic waste compared to industrial coastlines elsewhere. The 2019 dive by Victor Vescovo complicated this picture. He photographed what appeared to be a human-made plastic object on the seafloor at the Horizon Deep, the deepest point in the southern hemisphere. Whether that object represented the beginning of contamination spreading into the Tonga Trench, or an isolated piece of debris from an unusual source, is not settled. The broader concern is that the Tonga Trench's relative cleanliness may be temporary. Plastic pollution in the Pacific has increased every decade since plastic manufacturing expanded globally. Ocean current patterns shift subtly over years and decades. What is clean today is not guaranteed to remain clean. Scientists who documented the Tonga Trench's unexpectedly low contamination described it as an accidental control group, a rare deep-sea environment where the biological community has been studying life before significant human pollution reached it. That window, they noted, may not stay open long. The contrast between the Tonga Trench's relative cleanliness and the contamination found in other deep trenches raises a broader question about what scientists are measuring when they call a deep environment pristine. Microplastic sampling at the Tonga Trench was limited in scope compared to the surveys done at the Mariana and Kermadec trenches. The 2024 expedition included biological sampling across the full depth range of the trench. An analysis of those samples for microplastic contamination is still ongoing. A more complete picture of the Tonga Trench's pollution status will emerge as that analysis finishes, and the picture may differ from the early optimistic assessments, and what that biological community has to offer humanity may turn out to be more significant than anyone expected. The microbes living in the mud at the bottom of the Tonga Trench have spent millions of years solving a specific engineering problem. How do you keep biological machinery running under 16,000 pounds of pressure per square inch, in water just above freezing, in total darkness, with almost no food? The solutions they evolved are written into their chemistry. Their proteins are structured differently from surface organism proteins. Their cell membranes use different ratios of fatty molecules to maintain flexibility under pressure. Their enzymes operate efficiently at temperatures that would freeze the enzymes of most surface bacteria into near inactivity. Scientists studying deep-sea organisms for practical applications have found that these adaptations translate directly into useful tools. Enzymes from pressure-adapted microbes, called piezophiles, meaning pressure lovers, work efficiently at very low temperatures. This makes them extremely valuable in industrial processes where chemical reactions need to happen at cold temperatures without slowing down. Laundry detergent enzymes are one example that researchers have already explored. Enzymes that work in cold water, derived from cold-adapted deep-sea bacteria, could reduce the need for hot water washing cycles, cutting energy consumption. The same principle applies to food processing, where cold-temperature enzymatic reactions are common, and to certain pharmaceutical manufacturing processes where reaction temperatures need to remain low to avoid damaging fragile molecular products. The potential for new medicines is also significant. Deep-sea organisms live in environments so extreme that their competitors and predators are unlike anything found in surface ecosystems. Over millions of years, they have evolved chemical defenses and molecular tools to deal with threats that nothing else on Earth faces. Some of these chemical compounds have biological activities that surface chemistry has never produced. Hydrothermal vent communities, ecosystems built around volcanic heat sources on the seafloor, driven by chemosynthesis rather than sunlight, have already yielded promising compounds. Researchers have isolated potential antibiotic candidates from vent microbes, compounds that kill bacterial pathogens in laboratory tests that standard antibiotics cannot touch. Anti-cancer compounds derived from deep-sea organisms have entered early clinical testing. The Tonga Trench, with its extreme depth, fast geological activity, and relatively clean biological community, represents a potentially rich source of organisms carrying chemistry that has never been examined. The 2024 expedition collected biological and sediment samples that are still being analysed in laboratories around the world. Results from those analyses will take years to fully work through. Every new extreme environment that biologists characterise adds to the catalogue of what chemistry life has produced on this planet. And some of that chemistry, developed by organisms solving problems at the bottom of a 7-mile trench, may eventually solve problems for the species living 7 miles above them. The connection between deep-sea biology and medicine has already moved from theory to practice in a few specific areas. Enzymes from deep-sea bacteria have been incorporated into industrial processes. Compounds from deep-sea organisms have entered pharmaceutical development pipelines. The research pipeline from initial discovery to commercial application is long, typically a decade or more, but discoveries made today in Tonga Trench sediment samples could reach clinical or industrial use by the time the next generation of deep-sea researchers are running expeditions. The biology of the trench is not just scientifically interesting, it is economically and medically relevant in ways that are only beginning to be realised. But how much of the Tonga Trench have scientists actually explored? The 2024 Tonga Trench expedition was described by its lead scientists as the most ambitious, largest, and most comprehensive research effort ever conducted at these depths. They mapped 64,000 square miles of seafloor. They ran 104 lander deployments. They collected over 1,200 hours of video footage. They sampled biology from 3,000 feet down to the horizon deep. By any reasonable measure, it was an extraordinary scientific achievement, and vast sections of the Tonga Trench remain unknown. The trench is 850 miles long. The total area surveyed in 2024, while impressive, covered a fraction of the full trench system in the biological and geological detail needed to make meaningful claims about what lives throughout its entire length. Lander deployments, however numerous, cannot sample every section of a trench running the distance from Miami to New York. The video footage, 50 days of continuous recording, sounds enormous until you consider that it came from 37 sites. That leaves hundreds of miles of trench between sampled locations where the only information available is the sonar map of the seafloor shape, with no biological data at all. What organisms live in those unsurveyed sections, how populations change along the length of the trench, whether there are localized biological communities tied to specific geological features, all of that remains unknown. The Deep Sound Channel recordings from early expeditions documented the acoustic environment at a few locations. The sediment cores from those same expeditions sampled a handful of spots. The crewed dive in 2019 covered a small area of the horizon deep floor during a few hours on the bottom. All of this knowledge comes from points, scattered, isolated data points, in a system that runs for nearly 1,000 miles and plunges 7 miles deep. Beyond the Tonga Trench specifically, the broader problem is even starker. Less than 25% of the entire ocean floor has been mapped to the resolution that scientists have for most land surfaces. The ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface, and most of it remains less well charted than the surface of Mars. The Mariana Trench, the deepest place on Earth, and the most visited of the deep trenches, has received only a handful of crewed visits in all of human history. The second deepest trench, the Tonga Trench, has received one. Each expedition to a deep trench returns with findings that prompt more questions than the expedition answered. The snailfish turned out to be a top predator. Nobody predicted that before cameras went down. The amphipod community turned out to be more diverse than previous sampling suggested. The bigfin squid appeared in a place it had never been documented before. Every expedition to any deep trench has produced discoveries that changed what scientists thought they knew. The comparison to Mars is not rhetorical. NASA and other space agencies have invested in deep-sea research precisely because the Tonga Trench and other deep ocean environments provide test cases for life detection strategies. If a spacecraft ever reaches an icy moon with an ocean and needs to decide how to search for life, the approaches tested in the Tonga Trench, how to detect organisms in cold, dark, pressurized water with very low organic content, will directly inform the mission design. Understanding the deep ocean is, in part, preparation for understanding other worlds. There is no reason to think the Tonga Trench has finished producing surprises. There is every reason to think the biggest ones have not been found yet. The next era of deep-sea exploration is already being built. The technology that allowed Victor Vescovo to reach the horizon deep in 2019 was itself a step forward from everything that came before it. The titanium-hulled submersible he used, the DSV limiting factor, was part of a new generation of full ocean depth vehicles capable of reaching the bottom of any trench on Earth. Earlier crewed submersibles could reach most of the deep ocean, but were not rated for the absolute deepest points. Full ocean depth capability matters because the deepest points are precisely the ones scientists want to study most. The horizon deep, the deepest location in the southern hemisphere, has been visited once. The scientific community is already planning to return. Autonomous underwater vehicles are also changing what is possible. These robotic submarines, some no larger than a torpedo, others the size of a car, can be programmed to dive, survey and return without any human inside them. They carry cameras, sensors and sampling equipment. They can cover far more seafloor per expedition than a crewed vehicle could, and they can operate in conditions that would be too risky for a human pilot. The 2024 expedition used autonomous landers extensively. Future expeditions to the Tonga Trench will likely add autonomous vehicles that can move horizontally through the water column, mapping the biological community along the trench walls rather than only sampling at the points directly below the surface ship. Acoustic communication technology is also improving, making it possible to transmit higher quality data from deep-sea instruments to the surface ship in real time, rather than waiting hours or days for the instrument to physically surface with its recordings stored on board. Real-time data means scientists can see what the camera is seeing as it happens, redirect the instrument if something interesting appears, and make decisions about where to explore next based on live information from the bottom. The sediment and biological samples collected in 2024 are still being processed. Labs around the world are analysing the chemistry of mud cores, sequencing the DNA of organisms pulled from the trench, and examining video footage frame by frame to identify species and behaviours. The scientific output of a single major expedition runs for years after the ship returns to port. What those analyses will reveal is unknown, but the pattern from every previous deep-sea expedition holds. Each time scientists look more carefully at a deep trench, they find things they did not expect. New species, new behaviours, new chemistry, new evidence of physical processes that the models did not predict. The Tonga Trench produces unexpected things with reliable consistency. The earthquake zone is more active than any other. The volcanic arc is more violent. The biological community is richer and stranger than standard theory would suggest. And the trench's deepest point has been visited by a human being exactly once, for a few hours, and the full picture of what is down there remains almost entirely unexplored. The scientific community's interest in the Tonga Trench has grown steadily since the 2022 eruption put the entire region on the front page of global news. Funding for deep-sea research in the southwestern Pacific increased in the years following the event. The 2024 expedition was partly enabled by this increased attention. Researchers who had been proposing Tonga Trench expeditions for years found more institutional support after the world watched the most powerful observed volcanic eruption in modern history erupt from a volcano sitting directly above one of the deepest places on Earth. The trench's scientific importance had always been clear to specialists. The rest of the world caught up in January 2022. The next expedition is a matter of when, not if, and it will find something new. 7 miles below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, something is always happening. Roundworms are feeding in mud that has been accumulating for millions of years. Amphipods the size of rulers are swarming a piece of dead fish that fell from the surface months ago. A snailfish is drifting through the dark, hunting. Somewhere in the water column above the floor, a bigfin squid with 26-foot arms is feeling its way through absolute darkness. Tectonic plates are moving, 9 inches every year, grinding and diving and generating earthquakes at depths where earthquakes should not physically exist. All of this is happening right now, completely unobserved. The Tonga Trench matters to every human being on this planet, for reasons that go beyond scientific curiosity. The geological forces operating there affect real lives. The earthquakes it generates have killed people in Samoa, Tonga and neighbouring islands. The tsunamis it can trigger cross the entire Pacific in hours. The 2022 volcanic eruption produced atmospheric effects that were detected on every continent and injected enough water vapour into the stratosphere to potentially affect global temperatures for years. This is not a distant, isolated corner of the planet. It is one of the most geologically active places on Earth, connected to the rest of the world through seismic waves, atmospheric waves, ocean currents, and climate systems. The biology of the Tonga Trench connects to humanity in a different way. The organisms that have evolved in those extreme conditions carry chemistry that surface life never developed. The pressure-stable proteins, the cold-adapted enzymes, the novel chemical compounds produced by organisms with no other ecosystem on Earth to compete with. These may eventually yield medicines, industrial tools, and scientific insights that benefit people who will never think about ocean trenches at all. And the trench connects to the biggest question in all of science. Are we alone? Astrobiologists, scientists who study the potential for life on other worlds, use the Tonga Trench and other deep ocean environments as test cases for understanding where life can exist. The conditions at the horizon deep are crushing, cold, dark, and chemically extreme. Life thrives there anyway. The moons of Jupiter and Saturn, Europa, Enceladus, and others are thought to harbour liquid oceans beneath their icy surfaces. Those oceans would be dark, they would be pressurised, they would be cold, they would look a lot like the Tonga Trench. If we learn that life exists wherever liquid water exists, under whatever pressure and in whatever darkness, then the Tonga Trench is not just a strange deep place at the bottom of the Pacific. It is a proof of concept, evidence that life does not need sunlight, warmth, or calm conditions. It needs almost nothing, and it finds a way anyway. The trench was formed by violence, plates colliding, rock descending, seafloor tearing open. It is sustained by violence, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, geological forces moving faster than anywhere else on Earth. And in the middle of all of that violence, 7 miles below everything else, something fragile and extraordinary figured out how to live. That is the Tonga Trench, a place that generates the world's most extreme geology, harbours life that should not be possible, and sends its energy across the entire planet when it decides to move. Scientists are still only beginning to understand it, and the more they look, the bigger the mystery gets.